It's March of 1801. The War of the Second Coalition has been raging for 4 years. Great Britain, Austria, Russia, and a number of other European kingdoms were at war with the new Republic of France and its ally, Spain. The French Revolution had seen King Louis XVI and his wife, Marie Antoinette, beheaded, and the monarchy toppled. The coalition meant to stop revolution from spreading and to restore the monarchy to France. Lord Thomas Cochrane has been given command of the small coastal brig HMS Speedy and ordered to patrol the coast of Spain. Cochrane is hoping to come across smaller French or Spanish vessels so he can claim them as prizes. A merchant vessel with valuable cargo would suit him just fine. The young Scotsman is eager for a big payday and to turn around his declining financial fortunes. Though a lord and heir to the Earldom of Dundonald, his father had put the family in debt and was forced to sell the family estate of Culross. As Cochrane guides HMS Speedy along the scenic Spanish coast, he sees something in the distance and grabs his spyglass to get a better look. It is a large frigate, although he is unsure if it is friend or foe. He watches the frigate closely, and finally, he is certain. The frigate is following him. Cochrane signals to the frigate using the most recent British code, but gets no response. He takes another look, and now he is certain. This is a large and powerful French frigate, far too powerful for HMS Speedy to engage. Cochrane shouts out his orders, all sails at full. Sailors dash aloft, busily working the rigging, and the Speedy's sails snap into life, billowing out to catch the full force of the wind. Cochrane pushes the Speedy to its absolute limit in order to escape, but by morning the following day, the frigate had gained on her. Throughout the day, Cochrane maneuvers the Speedy to maximize his speed in order to outrun the looming threat, but to no avail. The French vessel is still gaining, although not yet in range for its guns. As the sun set again, Cochrane took his ship into darkness. The young captain knows the only way to follow a ship in the darkness is to look for small bits of light. But he has a plan, and orders his crew to gather together a few materials, quickly and quietly, and the men get to work. Throughout the night, the Speedy continues on, at the fastest speed Cochrane is willing to go in the dark, and he hopes for the best. On the French frigate, its captain has been carefully watching the light from the stern of the Speedy, shifting course when needed, to intercept her. Through the darkness, the frigate is gaining. Certainly by morning, the frigate will overtake the small British vessel. As dawn breaks, the French lookout spots something strange up ahead. As the frigate approaches, they find what they had been pursuing. It is a small wooden tub with a lantern affixed. Lord Thomas Cochrane and HMS Speedy were nowhere to be found. If this story sounds familiar, it is because it served as inspiration for the scene shown in the film Master and Commander, Far Side of the World, which itself is based on novels by Patrick O'Brian. In the novels, Captain Jack Aubrey often employs the same brash, creative, and sometimes reckless style often used by Lord Thomas Cochrane. The Scotsman would become famous for his heroic tactics, but infamous for his harsh criticisms of his superiors. Lord Thomas Cochrane, the Sea Wolf, today on Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs. Hello and welcome to Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs, Tales of Mishaps, Misfortune, and Misadventure. I'm your host, Rich Napolitano. Today's episode details the life of one of the more interesting characters from maritime history, Lord Thomas Cochrane. He is widely regarded as one of the most innovative captains of all time, with a unique ability to overcome overwhelming odds. But for all his successes, he never could defeat his greatest enemy, himself. Thomas Cochrane was born on the 14th of December, 1775, at Ansfield in Lanarkshire, Scotland. His father was Archibald Cochrane, the 9th Earl of Dundonald, and his mother Anna was the daughter of Captain James Gilchrist of the Royal Navy. Thomas came from a long line of naval service on both sides of his family, including his uncle, Admiral Sir Alexander Cochrane, and the man for whom he is named, his cousin, Admiral of the Fleet, Sir Thomas John Cochrane. Thomas Cochrane's childhood was spent at the Culross estate, featuring a Renaissance-style castle founded by Malcolm, the 7th Earl of Fife. Situated in an idyllic setting on the north shore of the Firth of Forth, 12 miles north of Edinburgh, it served as an abbey for Cistercian monks until the mid-1500s. After the English Reformation established the Church of England, the abbey was converted into a parish church. The house at the Culross estate was commissioned by Edward Bruce in 1608 and designed by celebrated English architect Inigo Jones. The stylish house adjoined the ruins of the original abbey from 1217. Culross passed from the Bruce family and into the Cochrane family when William Cochrane of Ochiltree married Lady Elizabeth Bruce in 1681. The estate included not only the castle and house, but vast tracts of forest and coal mines. William Cochrane had already inherited the Dundonald estate when he became the 7th Earl of Dundonald. The Bruces were a family of businessmen, law, and politics, and throughout their history had amassed a great deal of wealth. In contrast, the Cochranes were mostly career military men, knowing only of war. Archibald Cochrane inherited the Culross Abbey estate in 1778, becoming the 9th Earl of Dundonald. Archibald was very knowledgeable and respected in the field of industrial chemistry, and he made significant contributions to the field. In 1780, he developed a new and easier process for extracting tar from coal, and was granted 9 patents for his groundbreaking work with coal and other industrial materials. The father of the British tar industry, as he has been called, was a respected chemist who worked alongside some of the greatest minds of his time. But despite being respected as a chemist and inventor, his bad investments, along with some bad luck, bankrupted the family. Thomas's mother Anna had 7 pregnancies, producing 4 sons, before she died in 1784. Thomas and his brothers were educated at home by a constantly changing parade of private tutors, while his father continuously engaged in failing business schemes of one kind or another to get the family out of debt. The young Thomas had no formal education and mostly learned on his own. He was a very curious learner and enjoyed reading about his ancestral history and local geography. He learned of the 11th century Cochranes, who were described as sea rovers from Scandinavia, before settling in Scotland. Official documents first list the family name as Coverin, which later morphed into Cochrane. Thomas had 3 uncles on his father's side. Charles Cochrane had died at Yorktown while serving the crown during the American War of Independence. Basil Cochrane, however, led a less honorable life. Employed in India by the British East India Company, Basil mercilessly flogged 2 Indian workers for falsifying the books. One of the men survived, but another man died from his wounds. Basil Cochrane was dismissed from his position by a court of inquiry. However, Basil had much knowledge of the operations of the company, including a scam involving the selling of rotten food to supply ships. Fearing Basil may make these claims public, the company chose to retain him as a merchant. For the next 40 years, Basil Cochrane used his position to embezzle countless pounds from the Victualling Board Authority. When the company finally discovered the scam, they charged him with a debt of £9,000 to the company. Basil Cochrane fought these charges and won, even earning a judgment of £1,000 from the Victualling Board. Basil Cochrane's reputation effectively eliminated any hopes of Thomas someday starting a career with the East India Company. Another uncle, Colonel Andrew Cochrane Johnson, was a man of low moral character, a slave trader who used his position to accumulate his own personal wealth. He was accused of embezzling large sums of money while serving as governor of Dominica. He was stripped of his title of governor and forced to resign his commission in the army. Another uncle, Admiral Sir Alexander Cochrane, however, provided Thomas with brighter prospects. Alexander Cochrane was a highly regarded man of the Royal Navy, having served under Admiral Lord Rodney. His reputation allowed him to enter young Thomas Cochrane's name in numerous ships' logs, listing him as a midshipman. The Vesuvius, Caroline, La Sophie, and Hind all had records of Thomas Cochrane in their logs from the time Thomas was just 5 years old. Of course, the young boy did not actually serve aboard these ships. This practice was called false mustering, and allowed for Thomas to have an earlier start with the Royal Navy and a higher level of seniority. The Cochrane family's financial woes came to a head in 1793, when the Admiralty refused to purchase Archibald Cochrane's latest invention, a coal tar that could be applied to the hulls of ships and prevent damage from shipworms. Despite demonstrating the product in a successful test, neither the Admiralty or private shipbuilders were interested. After all, they profited from building and repairing ships, and this product would make ships far more durable. With no other choice, Archibald was forced to sell Culross Estate and all the mineral rights to the land in order to settle his debts. Thomas, now aged 16, was sent to the 104th Foot Regiment in London, after his uncle Colonel Andrew Cochrane Johnson arranged for his commission. Archibald, wanting his son to appear as a respected aristocrat, dressed Thomas in a yellow waistcoat and trousers, the color of the Whig Party, to which Archibald was loyal. Thomas's hair was smoothed down with candle wax and then powdered with flour. Making matters worse, the tall and lanky young man's outlandish clothing was ill-fitting, making him quite a spectacle on the streets of London. Cochrane was ruthlessly ridiculed for his appearance, causing him much distress. He had been raised by his father to never be ashamed, but the few weeks he spent in London were thoroughly miserable. Thomas returned home, vowing to never again serve in the army. By 1792, the French Revolution was in its third year. French ambassadors had been trying to convince King George III to side with the revolutionaries, or at least remain neutral. Initially, the king, as well as the people, believed there should be no interference with the internal affairs of France, and had no interest in going to war. But that all changed on the 21st of January, 1793, when King Louis XVI, his wife Marie Antoinette, and many other French members of court were executed. This was a detestable act in the eyes of the British Crown and the British people. French ambassadors to the king were sent home, and calls rang out for war with France. After a minor incident involving a British sloop near Brest, the new French regime declared war on England and Holland. Archibald Cochrane saw this as an opportunity for Thomas to join the Royal Navy, since the army was now out of the question. Because Thomas had his name registered in the logbooks with the Royal Navy, thanks to his uncle, he would have a head start in his naval career. Lacking funds to purchase a uniform for Thomas, Archibald borrowed £100 from Lord Hopetoun. Young Lord Cochrane's father gave him a uniform, a gold watch, and the remaining funds, along with some parting words. Don't expect any further inheritance. Thomas was to join the frigate Hind as a midshipman, where his uncle Alexander was captain. Lord Cochrane was ordered to report to Lieutenant Jack Larmor on the quarterdeck, but he only found a common seaman on the deck. Cochrane asked the man where he could find Lieutenant Larmor. To his surprise, this common seaman was Lieutenant Larmor, and the lieutenant treated him with utter disdain. Larmor grumbled, "A tall fellow over 6 feet high, the nephew of the captain, and a lord to boot, were not very promising recommendations." He ordered Cochrane down below, saying he had been saddled with a hard bargain. Cochrane remembered this encounter for the rest of his life, and it motivated him to earn his place on the ship. At age 17, Lord Thomas Cochrane had officially joined the Royal Navy. Cochrane departed on the Hind on a reconnaissance voyage, searching for French vessels in the North Sea. He quickly learned the discomforts of living on a warship. Lieutenant Larmor was hard on him, but fair, and being the captain's nephew, Cochrane was not subjected to the more disagreeable forms of hazing of a new midshipman. The Hind was a small frigate with 28 9-pound guns and a single gun deck. It was not a powerful warship, but served its purpose by scouting, escorting, and patrolling. The voyage was uneventful, and upon the return, both Cochrane and Larmor were reassigned to HMS Thetis. Bound for North America from Plymouth as part of Admiral Murray's fleet, Cochrane had the opportunity to continue to learn from Jack Larmor. Cochrane wrote of this time, "We became fast friends, and throughout life few more kindly recollections are impressed on my memory than those of my first naval instructor, honest Jack Larmor." Cochrane learned much under Larmor's tutelage, and performed his duties well. So well, in fact, that Admiral Murray named Cochrane as acting lieutenant of the Thetis in 1795, even though he had not yet passed his lieutenant's test. At the conclusion of his time on the Thetis, Cochrane was named acting lieutenant of HMS Africa. By 1796, Cochrane was 20 years old, and had enough seniority to now sit for his lieutenant's exam. The examination board threw many difficult navigation scenarios at Cochrane. His practical experience in the previous years and the instruction from Jack Larmor proved invaluable, and unlike many other midshipmen that day, Cochrane earned his commission as a lieutenant in the Royal Navy. Admiral Vandeput then appointed Cochrane to HMS Resolution, where the ship patrolled the waters from the St. Lawrence River to the Chesapeake Bay. But his time on the Resolution was frustrating for the young lieutenant. They encountered no French ships, had no combat, and often spent their time socializing. Cochrane was in desperate need of money, and the Royal Navy operated on the prize system. No battles meant no prize money. He talked often of his displeasure with the idleness of the Resolution, and he was sent back to England on the Thetis, where he was reassigned to HMS Barfleur, the flagship of Admiral Lord Keith's fleet. The Barfleur set out to take part in the blockade at Cadiz, as part of the war in the Mediterranean. Cochrane was hopeful for the prospects of capturing a prize, but patrolling the blockade proved to be just as tedious as his time on the Resolution. Cochrane became frustrated by the parliamentary officer appointees and the rigidity and formality demanded by his superior officers. Cochrane's immediate superior was First Lieutenant Philip Beaver, a man who junior officers secretly ridiculed, and Cochrane took his frustrations out on his first lieutenant. While anchored at the North African port of Tetuan, Cochrane and Captain Cuthbert of the Marines had been on shore duck hunting. The men returned to the ship shortly before it was scheduled to set sail, walking right past Lieutenant Beaver in plain sight. Still muddy from their hunt, the men went to change into clean uniforms before reporting to the wardroom for duty. Beaver approached Cochrane and Captain Cuthbert and berated them in front of the other officers. "You have both made me appear exceedingly ridiculous, for I have just reported you to the captain as left on shore, not having heard of your return to the ship." Cochrane replied dryly, "I cannot help it if you appear ridiculous to the captain." Astonished at this lack of respect, Beaver replied harshly, "Unless I am acquainted with your return to the ship, while I am first lieutenant, you shall not go out of this ship." Not to be belittled, Cochrane answered, "Aye, Lieutenant Beaver, I do not wish to hear more of the subject now, but you shall hear more from me on the subject another time." Cochrane then turned his back on the lieutenant and began whistling. Beaver promptly filed an application for Cochrane's court-martial, and the ships of the fleet gathered in all the pomp and circumstance accorded to such proceedings. Lord Keith presided over the court-martial. After hearing Beaver's argument, the court dismissed the charges, and Lord Keith himself advised Beaver to consult with his commanding officer before filing charges in the future. However, Thomas Cochrane was scolded, and he fell out of favor with the admiral. Lord Keith transferred his flag to HMS Queen Charlotte, but brought Cochrane along as one of his junior officers. In 1799, the Queen Charlotte was anchored off Palermo, Sicily. Admiral Horatio Nelson happened to be living on shore, enjoying his fame after his successful defeat of the French in southern Italy. Nelson met with Cochrane on several occasions to discuss naval tactics and strategies. On one occasion, when Nelson grew tired of Cochrane's textbook-style answers, he shouted, "Never mind the maneuvers, always go at them." This advice from Nelson made a huge impression on Cochrane, and he never forgot those words. One of the ships Nelson had captured during his victory over the French was the vessel Jeannereau. Nelson, impressed by Cochrane, suggests to Lord Keith to give command of the Genereux to Cochrane for its voyage to Sicily to Minorca. This was just the opportunity Lord Keith needed to rid himself of the brash young lieutenant, and so he agreed. For the 24-year-old Cochrane, this was a dream come true. The Genereux was a 74-gun warship, and even for such a short voyage, it was his chance to make his mark. But Lord Keith did him no favors. The ship was in poor condition, having just been through a battle, and it was crewed by the sick and injured men from the other ships of the fleet. Cochrane set out from Sicily with his new, albeit temporary ship, eager to prove his worth. But midway through his journey, it appeared it might be his last command. A vicious storm and heavy winds came on quickly, tossing the ship from side to side. There had been no time to reset the ship's rigging before departing. If he couldn't get the mainsail furled, the ship was in danger of being dismasted. The crew he had been given were in no shape to go aloft into the rigging, and Cochrane knew it was pointless to order them to do so. With no other choice, he called for his younger brother Archibald, who he had named as midshipman, and the two youthful Scotsmen climbed. In the raging storm, with the ship rocking back and forth wildly, they battled the heavy, wet rigging, struggling to control the sails. Seeing their captain and his brother bravely going aloft, the other men were inspired, and began climbing as well, assisting as they could. After much difficulty, the mainsail was furled, and the ship was saved. Not long after, the storm died down, and the Genereux proceeded to Minorca without incident. The young, confident, and some would say brash Lord Cochrane displayed his bravery and ingenuity in the face of extreme danger. After a short period of inactivity, Lord Keith gave Cochrane command of another ship, the HMS Speedy, in 1880. Once again, it appeared the Admiralty was punishing Cochrane for being flippant with a superior. The Speedy was a small coastal brig of just 158 tons. Its largest sail was smaller than the Genereux's smallest. Cochrane described the Speedy as little more than a burlesque of a vessel of war. The captain's cabin had only 5 feet of headroom, forcing the tall Scotsman to hunch over while inside. Showing his creativity, he opened the skylight in his cabin and placed a mirror on the deck above so he could stand upright to shave, with his head poking up out of the skylight. The Speedy was armed with 14 guns, although they were just 4-pounders, and carried 84 crew and 6 officers. This was hardly enough to engage in any meaningful battles. Cochrane, dismayed over the armaments, gathered up every ball that would be fired in a broadside. Together, they could fit in his coat pocket. It was not much, but at least he finally had command of his own ship. With his brother Archibald again joining him as midshipman, and Lieutenant William Parker as his second, the Speedy set out as an escort to a merchant convoy from Cagliari, Sardinia, on the 10th of May, 1800. Shortly after departing, a French privateer ship captured a Danish brig in the convoy. Risking the rest of the convoy, Cochrane brought his ship around and gave chase. The Speedy caught up and captured the 6-gun privateer ship Intrepid and rescued the Danish vessel. Cochrane wrote in his log, "Rescued the brig and captured the assailant." At long last, it was Cochrane's first prize ship. On the 14th of May, again, French privateers managed to board and capture 2 of the merchant ships in the convoy. Encouraged by his capture of the Intrepid, Cochrane pursued and overtook them, writing, "The breeze freshening, we came up with and recaptured the vessels, with the prize crews on board." He arrived in Livorno, Italy, with his prize Intrepid and over 50 French prisoners. Word of Lord Cochrane and the HMS Speedy began to spread. Several more prizes were captured over the next few months, and sailors became eager to join his crew, knowing there would be prize money to be shared. But his enemies also became aware of Cochrane and his tactics. Later that year, Lord Keith assigned the Speedy to patrol the coast of Spain. Cochrane had the Speedy painted to resemble the Dutch merchant ship Clomer, which traded up and down the coast. On the 21st of December, 1880, the Speedy came upon what appeared to be a large Spanish merchant ship, and Cochrane, seeing a valuable prize, gave chase. As the Speedy approached, the Spanish ship opened its gun ports, revealing powerful bronze guns. The diminutive Speedy was now facing a Spanish warship disguised as a merchant ship. Cochrane knew he was outgunned, and running was of no use. Instead, he ordered his crew to raise the Dutch flag, and anyone wearing a British uniform was ordered below. A crewman then appeared on deck, wearing the uniform of a Dutch sailor. This crewman had the physical appearance of a Dutchman and could speak Dutch fluently. Cochrane specifically hired this man in Minorca in preparation for this exact situation. The crewman called out to the Spanish frigate, but still they approached in their boats, intending to board and capture the Speedy. In his best Spanish, the crewman shouted that his vessel was in quarantine due to an outbreak of plague. Alarmed, the Spaniards hesitated, then began rowing back to their own ship. Soon enough, the Spanish frigate was sailing away at great speed. No prize is worth a plague outbreak, and Cochrane took full advantage of this fear, using deception and ingenuity instead of his guns. On May 5, 1801, the Speedy was off the coast of Barcelona when a group of Spanish gunboats were spotted. Cochrane pursued them, only to find the powerful frigate El Gamo in his way. This was possibly a trap, using Cochrane's aggressiveness to lure him in. El Gamo had 32 guns and over 300 sailors and marines, and was 4 times larger than the Speedy. To make matters worse, over half of Cochrane's crew had been placed aboard prize ships over the last few weeks. He was badly outgunned, outmanned, and barely had enough crew to even sail the ship. Cochrane used the only weapons he had against the Spanish frigate: speed and surprise. The last thing the Spaniards expected was for the tiny Speedy to engage for battle, but that is exactly what Cochrane did. The Speedy began racing toward El Gamo, and the frigate fired a shot, which went sizzling past the Speedy into the water beyond. Cochrane then ordered an American flag to be raised, causing much confusion for the Spaniards. They were unsure whether to let the Speedy pass by or fire upon her. Cochrane used this confusion by racing around El Gamo's leeward side. In short, this was advantageous, as the wind would cause El Gamo to heel toward her target, causing its guns to point more downward. Cochrane then lowered the American flag and raised the British ensign. El Gamo opened fire on the Speedy, causing minimal damage. The Speedy rushed in close to El Gamo, entangling her topmast with the yards of the Spanish frigate. The Speedy was so close, the blast from El Gamo's guns sailed well past the smaller vessel. Cochrane ordered his men to double-shot the guns and wait until the Speedy was right alongside El Gamo. At just the right moment, Cochrane ordered his guns to open fire. The double shot of the guns blasted upwards violently through El Gamo's gun deck and into the main deck, ripping through wood and human bodies alike. The actions of the Speedy were so utterly incomprehensible that the Spaniards had no response. El Gamo's captain and boatswain were both killed, demoralizing the confused and frightened crew. Attempts were made by Spanish Marines to board the Speedy, but each time Cochrane swung his ship away and then blasted the Marines with muskets. Cochrane saw an opportunity to capture a Spanish warship and would stop at nothing. He wrote, "The great disparity of force rendering it necessary to adopt some measure that might prove decisive, I resolved to board. Either take the frigate or be themselves taken, in which case the Spaniards would give no quarter." Leaving the ship's surgeon at the helm of the Speedy, Cochrane and his men boarded El Gamo for hand-to-hand combat. The Spanish crew was depleted but still numerous. However, their advantage was lost amidst the congested deck with not much space to move around. Still, as Cochrane was pinned at the stern of El Gamo, he shouted loudly to launch the next wave of attackers. Of course, there were no more men to attack, but this order alone caused much fear, and the Spaniards gave up the attack. Cochrane looked up and saw the Spanish flag being lowered, signaling surrender. In fact, it was one of Cochrane's own crew who had lowered the flag, but nevertheless, the fight was over for the demoralized Spaniards. Cochrane had defeated over 300 with just 48 of his own. The magnificent and unbelievable victory amazed even Cochrane's critics. His superior officer, Captain Manly Dixon, described the very spirited and brilliant action in a letter to the Admiralty. But through his actions with Lieutenant Beaver, Cochrane had made an enemy with the First Lord of the Admiralty, Lord St. Vincent. St. Vincent was not impressed at all with Cochrane's disrespect of a superior officer, and was not inclined to do Cochrane any favors. El Gamo was an extremely valuable prize, but seemingly just to spite Cochrane, the Spanish frigate was auctioned off as a merchant vessel, resulting in very little prize money. Traditionally, Cochrane would have been promoted to the rank of post captain and given command of his prize ship, but as El Gamo was auctioned off, there was no frigate for him to command, and therefore no promotion. Cochrane was extremely displeased, but rather than argue on behalf of himself, he requested the promotions of Lieutenant Parker, who was wounded in the battle, and also for his brother Archibald. But his requests fell on deaf ears at the Admiralty. Cochrane continued to argue and write letters to St. Vincent and to others in the Admiralty, but it only further made him a pest in the eyes of his superiors. Still captain of the Speedy, Cochrane resumed patrolling the waters off the coast of Spain. His luck ran out on July 3, 1801, when he spotted 3 French galleons on the horizon. These were the vessels Indomitable, Formidable, and Dessay, 3 of the most powerful ships in the French fleet. Cochrane attempted to escape, even dumping his guns and extra cargo overboard. Cochrane made a valiant effort to elude capture, but was forced to surrender for the sake of his crew. He was brought aboard the Dessay, where he surrendered his sword to Captain Christy Pallier. Upon being presented the sword, Pallier responded, "I will not accept the sword of an officer who has for so many hours struggled against improbability." Cochrane remained a prisoner of the French at Algeciras, Spain, for a short time until being exchanged, and then sent to Gibraltar. During his captivity, he thought back on his exploits and counted 50 vessels captured, 122 guns, and 534 prisoners. Having lost his ship, it was mandatory for a Royal Navy captain to face court-martial, which took place on the 18th of July, 1801. Cochrane was acquitted promptly and set free. With the signing of the Treaty of Amiens in 1802, there was no more war to be fought, and Thomas Cochrane returned to the College of Edinburgh. When hostilities again resumed in 1803, Cochrane wished to resume his naval duties. However, he was a captain without a ship. Cochrane visited Lord St. Vincent personally to voice his displeasure. "If the board is evidently of the opinion that my services are not required, it will be better for me to go back to the College of Edinburgh and pursue my studies with a view of occupying myself in some other employment." St. Vincent then granted him command of the HMS Arab. This was a woefully pathetic vessel, and once again meant to punish Cochrane. Cochrane said of the Arab, "She will sail like a haystack," and compared her to a collier. Cochrane described his 3 months at sea on the Arab as a blank in my life. He still managed to make news while in command of the Arab when he intercepted the American merchant ship Chatham, bound for Amsterdam. Cochrane created a story of a blockade at Amsterdam and ordered the Chatham to turn around. While there was no battle, Cochrane's actions enraged the American ambassador in London and future U.S. President, James Monroe. That's going to do it for Part 1 of Lord Thomas Cochrane, the Sea Wolf. Thank you so much for listening. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is written, edited, and produced by me, Rich Napolitano. You can follow the show at ShipwrecksPod on social media or at shipwrecksandseadogs.com. If you'd like to support the show and make a one-time donation, you can do so at buymeacoffee.com/shipwreckspod. Or you can support the show by subscribing to Into History at intohistory.com/shipwreckspod. You'll get ad-free access to this and many other great history podcasts, plus bonus content and a private Discord channel. Original theme music is by Sean Siegfried, and you can find him at seansiegfried.com. Be sure to listen to Part 2, but until then, don't forget to wear your life jackets.